October 14th, 1943. 26,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The air was thin, the light harsh, and the sky burned with the white contrails of battle. Captain Don Blakesley tightened his gloved hand around the control stick of his P-47 Thunderbolt, eyes scanning the chaos below. 316 B-17 flying fortresses lumbered toward their target, Germany's critical ball-bearing factories. Around them swarmed more than 300 Luftwaffe fighters, flashing like knives in sunlight. Each minute felt like a slow-motion execution. Blakesley's fuel gauge trembled near empty. He had 20 minutes before his squadron would have to turn back. 20 minutes to protect bombers that still had 3 hours before reaching England. The arithmetic was merciless. The P-47 could escort bombers only a few hundred miles into Germany before fuel starvation forced a retreat. After that, the bombers were alone, easy prey for the waiting German interceptors. Over the radio, voices cracked with static and panic. 2 more forts down. Christ, they're tearing them apart. Blakesley's eyes hardened. He wanted to stay. Every pilot did. But the gauges didn't lie. The order came with a heavy heart: return to base. As he banked westward, the gray sky filled with black dots of burning bombers spiraling downward. 600 men would not return that day. In his debriefing later, Blakesley's words were simple but searing. We need a fighter that can go all the way to Berlin and back. Until we get one, we're sending bomber crews to die. What he didn't know was that somewhere across the Atlantic, the very fighter he needed already existed. It sat forgotten inside a hangar in Ohio, officially rejected, quietly gathering dust. An unwanted machine the experts had dismissed as unsuitable for high-altitude combat. Yet inside that rejected frame hid the potential to change the war. 2 years earlier, in the desperate summer of 1941, Britain had stood alone. Its cities burned nightly under German bombing raids, and its Royal Air Force was running out of fighters. The mighty Spitfire was brilliant but scarce. The rugged Hurricane was already outdated. Britain needed something new, and fast. The British Purchasing Commission turned to American industry. They first approached North American Aviation to license-build the old P-40 Warhawk, but North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold promise. "Give us 120 days," he said, "and we'll design you a better fighter from scratch." It sounded impossible. It was also true. Chief Engineer Edgar Schmud and his team worked with sleepless urgency. They designed a revolutionary airframe using laminar flow wings that sliced drag by half. They positioned the radiator behind the pilot, exploiting something called the Meredith effect, which turned hot air into thrust. Every curve of the fuselage was shaped by mathematics, not guesswork. A mere 117 days later, on October 26, 1940, the prototype flew. The British named it the Mustang. It was fast, graceful, and agile, a technological leap built by a team that refused to believe in limitations. But perfection has a cruel habit of hiding a flaw. The Mustang's American-built Allison V-1710 engine was powerful at low altitude but suffocated in thin air. Above 15,000 feet, its single-stage supercharger gasped for oxygen. Speed collapsed. Climb rate vanished. At 25,000 feet, the realm of bomber warfare, it was a sitting duck. Pilots loved how it handled close to the ground. They hated how it died in the sky. British engineers shrugged. The plane would have to serve as a low-level reconnaissance and ground attack craft. The U.S. Army Air Forces tested it, filed their report, and stamped the verdict. Excellent at low altitude. Useless where it counts. By 1942, the Mustang seemed destined to fade into a footnote, another promising experiment buried by circumstance. That fate might have held if not for one man, someone who wasn't a general or even a fighter pilot. His name was Ronald Harker. He was 30 years old, a quiet Rolls-Royce test pilot stationed at Hucknell in England. His world revolved around engines, not dogfights. He tested the Merlin engines that powered Spitfires and Lancasters, engines he knew as intimately as his own heartbeat. In late April 1943, Harker visited RAF Duxford to observe a squadron flying Mustangs in low-level reconnaissance. Over lunch, a pilot complained to him, half joking. "She's a beauty below 15,000. Above that, she's a brick with wings." Someone offered Harker a test hop. He accepted. That afternoon, as the Mustang streaked across the English countryside, Harker felt something most others had missed. The airframe was near perfect, light, balanced, forgiving. It wanted to fly higher, faster. It simply lacked the lungs to breathe thin air. He landed with a thought that refused to die. What if you gave this aircraft a new heart, the Merlin engine he knew so well? The Merlin thrived where the Allison choked. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger could keep full power beyond 30,000 feet. In a Spitfire it delivered miracles. In a Mustang, it might deliver something the Allies had never possessed before. A single-engine fighter fast enough to catch the enemy and with range long enough to bring bombers home alive. But such an idea was not his to speak. As a test mechanic, Harker had no authority to suggest modifications to foreign aircraft. Doing so would violate every regulation in the book. It would be, in the words of his superiors, gross insubordination. Yet he couldn't stay silent. That evening, he sat in his quarters, the hum of distant factory engines filling the night, and began to write. His report, dated May 3, 1943, was brief but bold. The Mustang's airframe is superior to any in service. Its limitation lies only in the Allison engine. Fitting the Rolls-Royce Merlin would produce a fighter combining exceptional range with high-altitude performance exceeding any current design. He signed it, sent it, and waited. By morning, he'd broken chain of command, national boundaries, and perhaps his career. But in doing so, he had just set in motion the birth of the most feared fighter in the skies. The report landed on the desk of Air Vice Marshal Wilfred Freeman, a man known for ignoring limits when lives were on the line. Freeman read Harker's words twice, then placed the paper flat on his desk and whispered, "This could change everything." But he faced a wall of politics. The Americans had already tested the Mustang and labeled it inadequate. Suggesting otherwise would bruise egos across two nations. The Merlin engine was British property, the Mustang an American design. Merging them without permission could ignite a diplomatic storm. Freeman chose action over permission. He forwarded Harker's report to the Ministry of Aircraft Production with a note. "This may be the most important recommendation I've read this year. Pursue it quietly." Behind closed hangar doors, Rolls-Royce engineers began their rebellion. At the Hucknell facility, technicians wheeled in a Mustang Mark I, serial number AL975. The aircraft still wore its dull olive RAF paint, a machine meant for reconnaissance flights. Over the following weeks, its American engine was pulled from its mounts. The cavern left behind seemed almost sacrilegious, like tearing out a living heart. In its place, they began to fit the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61. The process was anything but simple. The Merlin was heavier, longer, and thirstier for air. New engine mounts had to be fabricated from scratch. The cowling was reshaped, the radiator system rebuilt, and the propeller replaced to handle different torque. Even the fuel lines were rerouted by hand. Each modification violated agreements between governments. Every day the workers risked reprimand, or worse. But they pressed on. They called it the Hucknell Project, though among themselves they had another name, the Quiet Miracle. By early October 1943, after 4 months of night work and whispered shifts, the converted Mustang stood gleaming on the tarmac. Its engine bay bulged slightly where the new Merlin sat. The mechanics joked that the plane looked impatient to fly. On October 13th, with a pale autumn sun hanging low, Ronald Harker climbed into the cockpit. He had started all this with a forbidden idea. Now he would test it with his own hands. As the propeller spun and the Merlin roared to life, the airfield vibrated with a deeper, throatier growl than anyone had ever heard from a Mustang. He taxied down the runway, pushed the throttle, and the aircraft leapt forward like it had been waiting its whole life for this engine. The tail lifted, wheels left the ground, and the Merlin Mustang rose clean into the blue. At 25,000 feet, Harker opened the throttle wide. The needle climbed beyond 400 miles per hour. The climb rate doubled. The controls stayed steady, graceful. The airframe and engine seemed born for each other. When he landed, he could barely contain the words. "The Merlin Mustang," he wrote in his test report the next day, "is the finest fighter I have ever flown at any altitude." Within days, RAF pilots confirmed it. Squadron leader Michael Robinson described it simply. "It outclimbs, outturns, and outruns everything above 15,000 feet. And it can stay in the air long after the others must turn back." What had begun as an act of insubordination had now created the perfect escort fighter. The plane that could reach Berlin and still bring its pilot home. The British results traveled fast, carried across the Atlantic in coded cables. At Wright Field, Ohio, American engineers stared at the numbers in disbelief. Speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour at altitude. range stretching past 2,000 miles with drop tanks. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, read the reports in silence. When he finished, he issued a direct order. Convert 2 P-51s with Packard-built Merlins immediately. Test them. Report directly to my office. But Arnold's command found an eager audience. North American aviation had already begun its own secret experiment. Chief designer Edgar Schmid had long suspected that the Allison engine was the Mustang's weak link. When Packard, the Detroit automaker licensed to build Merlins for Britain, offered sample engines, Schmid's team didn't wait for authorization. They began designing a conversion plan in quiet defiance, mirroring Harker's actions across the ocean. By late November 1943, 2 prototypes, labeled NA-102 and NA-103, rolled out of the hangar at Inglewood, California. Company test pilot Robert Chilton took the first American-built Merlin Mustang into the sky on November 30th. What he experienced echoed Harker's revelation. Effortless climb, blistering speed, remarkable balance. The plane felt alive. At 25,000 feet, the P-51B outpaced the Thunderbolt by 40 miles per hour and the Lightning by 55. Its combat radius, once barely 250 miles, now reached 650 without external tanks. With drop tanks attached, it could go 800, enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back. The data left the bureaucrats nowhere to hide. The numbers didn't argue, they shouted. On December 20th, 1943, General Arnold sent his final directive. All production Mustangs will receive the Packard Merlin engine. End Allison installations. Expand manufacture immediately. Assembly lines roared to life. Inglewood, California, produced the P-51B. A new plant in Dallas built the identical P-51C. By spring 1944, hundreds rolled off the lines every month. The rejected design was reborn as America's new frontline weapon. The first Merlin Mustangs reached England in early December 1943, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustangs. Pilots raised their eyebrows at the plane's size. It looked small beside the massive P-47 Thunderbolt, its single engine a far cry from the twin-engine P-38 Lightning. Many doubted it could survive long against German aces. Their doubts vanished over northern France. On December 5th, the Mustangs escorted B-17s toward Amiens. As the formation climbed through 25,000 feet, the bombers watched their escorts pull ahead with ease. When German FW-190s appeared, the Mustangs dove like hawks, accelerating beyond 500 miles per hour. Lieutenant Charles Gunn, on his first Mustang mission, engaged 2 German fighters. Expecting him to zoom past as a Thunderbolt would, the Germans tried to evade by climbing. Gunn stayed on their tails, his Merlin engine howling. Both enemy aircraft fell in flames. He climbed back to bomber altitude and still had fuel to spare. His combat report was brief. The P-51 does everything the P-47 does and still brings you home. Word spread quickly through the airfields of England. Squadrons transitioning from Thunderbolts and Lightnings to Mustangs found themselves flying farther, fighting longer, and losing fewer men. By February 1944, more fighter groups had joined them. Among them was Don Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group, the same man who months earlier over Schweinfurt had begged for a plane that could reach Berlin. When he climbed into the cockpit of his new Merlin-powered Mustang, he said quietly, "This is the one we've been waiting for." What he didn't know then was that this machine, born from an illegal test flight and a mechanic's defiance, would soon change the balance of power in the skies. By the start of 1944, the air war over Europe had entered a new phase. For the first time, the United States possessed a fighter that could escort bombers from English bases all the way to the heart of Germany and back. The Luftwaffe, once master of the continent's skies, was about to face an enemy it could neither outfly nor outlast. General James Doolittle, newly placed in command of the 8th Air Force, understood what the Mustang meant. His orders to the fighter groups were revolutionary. No longer would escorts simply fly alongside bombers and wait for German attacks. Doolittle told them to range ahead, hunt down enemy fighters wherever they could be found, and destroy them on the ground if possible. The mission was no longer just to defend. It was to dominate. The Mustang made that doctrine possible. Its range and endurance gave it freedom of the sky that no other aircraft had ever possessed. Pilots swept ahead of the bombers, diving into German airspace like wolves loosed from a chain. They hit airfields, strafed hangars, caught enemy fighters taking off or landing, and turned every encounter into a trap the Luftwaffe could not escape. German intercept tactics began to collapse within months. New Luftwaffe directives circulated, warning pilots to avoid prolonged combat with the long-range American fighter identified as the P-51 Mustang. Attack the bombers quickly, one order read, then disengage before the escorts arrive. But disengaging was easier written than done. The Mustang was faster in level flight, climbed more sharply, and could dive with precision. Even when German fighters tried to break off, the Mustang followed, relentless. The psychological toll was immense. Luftwaffe veterans who had once ruled the skies over France and the Channel now spoke of dread, the dread of hearing that distant, distinct Merlin roar. From March to June 1944, the results were undeniable. Bomber losses fell sharply. In March, 131 bombers were lost. By April, the number had dropped to 70. In May, 61. By June, just 42. Behind those statistics lay a truth the German command could no longer deny. The Allies had achieved air superiority. Every new fighter group that converted to the Mustang made the effect stronger. The 357th Fighter Group in February, the 4th in March, the 352nd soon after. Each brought its own aces, its own tactics, and its own respect for the new machine. Pilots spoke about it with reverence. Major George Preddy called it a Spitfire with endurance. Major John Meyer said, "You can't trap a Mustang pilot if he's competent. He can always extend, escape, and come back when he chooses." And Colonel Francis Gabreski, who had already made his name in the Thunderbolt, found in the Mustang a weapon that magnified his skill tenfold. The aircraft's design gave pilots a rare gift, a second chance. The bubble canopy offered clear visibility in every direction, while the Merlin's power could pull a wounded plane home even when riddled with holes. Captain Donald Lopez once returned to base with 67 punctures in his fuselage and wings, one aileron shredded, the rudder nearly gone. "It flew like it was angry," he later said, but it flew. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Luftwaffe was broken. The invasion of Normandy unfolded under near-total Allied control of the air. That morning, the German Air Force managed just over 300 sorties against more than 14,000 Allied flights. Above the beaches, Mustangs cruised in wide orbits, striking at anything that dared rise from a German airfield. They were not just fighters now, they were guardians of the invasion itself. Throughout the summer of 1944, the sky belonged to them. The Mustang's kill-to-loss ratio soared to 11-1. Luftwaffe reports grew shorter, more desperate. New German fighters, the FW-190D and Bf-109G, were introduced to match the Mustang's power, but they came too late and in too few numbers. Even the advent of jet fighters could not reverse the tide. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was faster in straight flight, but it was fragile, slow to take off, and vulnerable when landing. Mustang pilots learned to circle above German airfields, waiting. When the jets returned low on fuel, they pounced. The speed advantage in the air mattered little when the enemy never got there alive. The numbers told the story. By war's end, 15,575 Mustangs had been built. Nearly 9,000 of them were the P-51D model, the definitive version with a bubble canopy and 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns. In the months following D-Day, production peaked at 550 aircraft per month, rolling off lines in California and Texas like steel birds born for battle. They destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in the air and another 4,000 on the ground. No other American fighter came close. Of every 100 Mustangs built, fewer than 17 were lost in combat, a lower rate than any other major Allied fighter. By late 1944, the Mustang had become more than a weapon, it was a symbol. To Allied airmen, it meant survival. To German soldiers on the ground, it meant the sound of defeat. One German infantryman, Franz Weber, later described the feeling in his post-war memoirs. By 1945, he wrote, "We no longer looked up to see if planes were American or British. They were all Mustangs. They were everywhere, at every altitude, hunting us on the roads, over the forests, even on our own runways. When I heard that engine note, I knew the war was lost." The war's end did not end the Mustang story. It served in Korea, strafing enemy convoys and supporting ground troops long after newer jets took over the skies. Many nations adopted it for their own defense, flying it into the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s. And today, more than 150 still fly in private hands, the sound of their engines echoing across air shows and anniversaries, a living heartbeat from another age. Yet the true legacy of the Mustang lies not in its statistics, but in the lesson behind its birth. It was proof that genius does not always wear rank or uniform. That innovation can come from those closest to the tools, from people willing to see what others dismiss. Ronald Harker had no authority to redesign aircraft. He had no mandate to challenge American procurement or military convention. All he had was understanding, and the courage to act on it. He broke rules, crossed boundaries, and risked his future because he knew what was right for the war, not what was safe for his career. The bureaucrats called his act illegal. History called it visionary. From a single unauthorized test flight in April 1943 to the Mustang's dominance by spring 1944, less than 12 months passed. In that single year, a rejected aircraft became the deadliest fighter in the world. The Mustang did what its critics said was impossible. It escorted bombers to Berlin and brought them home again. Don Blakesley, who once watched bombers die helplessly over Schweinfurt, would later lead his Mustang-equipped 4th Fighter Group to more than 500 enemy aircraft destroyed, the highest total in the 8th Air Force. When asked years later what changed, he answered simply, "We finally had the tool we needed. Once we got the Mustang, everything changed. We stopped surviving missions and started winning them." Today, when a restored P-51 takes to the air, the sound it makes, the deep, resonant growl of the Merlin engine, is more than mechanical. It's the echo of an idea born in defiance. Its wings carry not only history but a principle. That progress often begins with someone who refuses to accept the word no. The Mustang's story is one of partnership across oceans, of British design meeting American muscle, and of one man's refusal to stay within the lines drawn by bureaucracy. It is a reminder that victory favors those willing to think differently. The mechanic who broke the rules never became famous. His name faded into technical archives and footnotes. But his legacy soars every time a Mustang rises from the runway, and that unmistakable Merlin note splits the air. It is the sound of courage, of rebellion, of clarity in an age of confusion. And it is the sound of proof that sometimes the smallest act of defiance can change the course of history. Because history, in the end, isn't only written by generals. Sometimes it's rewritten by a mechanic who dared to believe he could build a better fighter, and did.